Okay, as promised last week, here's my look at the issue of harassment, notably sexualized harassment in virtual reality games. This is probably going to piss a lot of people off, including some people who are part of blacklisting me, but I think it's important enough to discuss that I'm willing to take this risk. But before I begin, please be respectful. Please do not comment until you have watched this entire video, and please do not attack people in your responses. Okay, here we go. The issue of harassment, groping, whatever in virtual reality made headlines months ago during the 2016 Game Developers Conference in March. I'm not sure if this was the first time, but this high-profile instance was certainly long enough ago that developers have had the opportunity to avoid the more recent scandal. Back at GDC 2016, Minority Media's Patrick Harris presented an experiment he'd done with a female colleague showing that harassment in virtual reality had the potential to be far more visceral, far more intimidating, and therefore far more psychologically damaging than the harassment that happens in traditional video games. The experiment was simulating harassment in a VR environment, virtual groping, invasion of personal space, menacing gestures, stuff like that. What they found, in essence, was that virtual reality is so immersive that it was a disturbing experience, not just for the female staff member that participated, but for Harris himself, who had to play the role of harasser. At the time, I thought this was a good step forward despite the unpleasantness of the experience. Instead of presenting a purely theoretical position like so many people do when it comes to these issues, Minority Media did a small experiment and presented their findings. They took the first step towards proving actual harm, which is something that's desperately needed in these debates. But I was in the minority with that opinion, pardon the pun. The outraged press went wild, claiming that Patrick Harris was a real online abuser, not just someone who had to do something unpleasant for the purpose of a playtest. Minority issued an apology in June and formed a partnership with some university types, which in gaming these days is the equivalent of lawyering up. Here's the thing. If game companies can't test these things internally without massive industry backlash, the public becomes guinea pigs in the ongoing parade of preventable mistakes. And so, months later, here we are, in the middle of a completely preventable scandal that allows political opportunists intent on turning video games into propaganda machines to seed the press with negative articles. And I can state that intent with a relative amount of certainty because of leaked chat logs where at least one of the people sourced in these recent articles was helping plot the destruction of my career on the grounds that they believe my work hurts women. The current scandal is that some women have had bad experiences in a particular video game because this game didn't have appropriate privacy controls built in to allow people to select the kind of experience they want to have. This is undeniably a design mistake since it limits player choice in a way that adds nothing to the narrative experience. It's also obviously been bad for business. The big dilemma now is, what do we do? Well, the first step is to determine whether we should do anything at all. And I think that Minority Media's work is useful in determining that yes, we should. But we need to isolate why action is needed. We can all agree that the things that go on in virtual reality aren't the same as things that happen in the real world. There's no touch sensation when you're VR groped, and there's also no smell. In my own experiences with a guy forcing a kiss on me at San Diego Comic-Con, the thing I remember most years later is the smell of sweat and stale beer on the guy. VR is limited to sight and sound. It's obscenity and lack of personal space that are on the table here. That doesn't mean that these things can't cause harm. Invading someone's personal space can be really unnerving, especially for survivors of real-life sexual assault, or for people who, for various reasons, prefer more personal space. I've experienced how unnerving close proximity to zombies can be in some horror VR demos. But complicating this issue is the long-accepted practice of teabagging, a practice popularized in games like Halo that simulates sex acts on corpses. When it was seen as something male players did to male players, it was treated by most as no big deal. So for many, it's confusing to get upset about avatars molesting avatars now. That's a fair point. Treating simulated sexual assault as no big deal when it's in the male sphere, then freaking out about it when it happens to women is benevolent sexism. Teabagging has been something I've never been comfortable with, mostly because it hinges on emasculating other players and the vague homophobia of treating the simulation of a gay sex act as some sort of dominating gesture or insult. But teabagging was such an accepted practice that Bungie added a head animation to defeated player avatars to make teabagging look more like an oral sex act. I believe it was in Halo 3 that we first had the corpse's head raise up more to look like sucking Master Chief's sweaty tin can balls. And I remember how awkward and conflicting that was to watch for the first time as a member of the press. As a gamer, I just shook my head at how juvenile it was. But as a professional, God damn it, Bungie, was encouraging that really a good idea? It's one thing to let players do it, but stay above the fray, developers. Full disclosure, I have teabagged an enemy precisely once. It was in Resistance 3 after a boss fight that really pissed me off. My husband can verify. It was not one of my proudest moments. So I'm not approaching this as someone who's trying to seem holier than thou. I just also realize that simulating any situation where men are forced into sex acts with other men for laughs, that can cause increased shame in men who have been abused. The whole teabagging thing wasn't one of gaming's finer moments. I'm not saying it's wrong, but in retrospect, it was kind of insensitive. It also set a precedent, since such a massive franchise like Halo didn't just tolerate teabagging, but actively encouraged it by adding animations. It's totally understandable why many gamers are having major WTF reactions to the latest Avatar abuse scandal. Gamers are absolutely right that it is benevolently sexist to treat unwanted touching of men as less serious than unwanted touching of women. The argument with VR is that in VR it feels more real, and that's a valid perspective, even though it's somewhat subjective. Again, you don't feel the groping, so I personally find the experience dissonant and cheesy looking. I've even tried VR porn and found it to be like an out-of-body experience with locked-in syndrome, but those are my reactions. I accept that someone else's could be far different, and they could find the invasion of their personal space extremely unpleasant. That's fair. Some would say then, just don't play VR games. And that's also a fair perspective to have. It just may not be an especially good business strategy. Clear game labeling regarding what sort of experience the game offers is a good idea for those developers who don't care about maximizing their consumer base and want to let players be as lewd as they want based on a freedom of speech philosophy. I wouldn't personally play those games. However, I'm far too aware of slash fiction to claim that no one would want to play a game where groping was committed. We'll probably have furry YIF simulator before you know it, and that's fine. But what do we do about games that are more general interest, particularly games children play? As Minority Media determined back in March, there isn't a simple single solution. You can prevent people from touching, something I think is a good idea from a design standpoint, because you can't feel the touch you can see, and that's weird. But that doesn't take away the potential for obscene gestures and other things players will do just to test the limits of what a game allows. It's important to keep in mind that most gamers make a very clear distinction between what they do in the real world and what they do in-game. This is brushed aside by many commentators, but it's valid. Many people enjoy playing video games in the role of villains, and being a bad guy means doing bad things. This doesn't necessarily mean that these players want to do these bad things in the real world. They're playing a role. Being a pig is generally seen as a bad thing. So creatively, it doesn't make sense to deny players the freedom to be bad, since stories need villains. But then we get into the complicating factor that being a pig to women is much more common in media bad guys than sexually harassing men. This imbalance is something that we also need to consider because it leads to imitated behavior. Too many games, movies, TV shows, and so on use the sexual subjugation of women as a shorthand to villainy. They don't touch the reality that men also get sexually abused, harassed, and demeaned nearly as often, and so it's less likely seen as that shortcut to villainy I mentioned as an artistic device, albeit a lazy one. So I'm going to offer a gameplay-based solution to this VR groping issue. Yeah, have the settings that allow people a bubble of space around them if they so choose. Fine. but also have a mechanism in-game that gives people the ability to fight back against obscene gestures. Back in the old days, you could give a guy a good hard smack if they got inappropriate, and you should be able to blast them away in-game if they behave like pigs. If there are potential in-game consequences for bad behavior, then people will be less likely to do it. So, give players the equivalent of a force push in-game. If someone invades a player's personal space and they want them to stop, they should be able to perform a devastating melee attack that stomps flat any player within a certain proximity. The groper can't claim they were falsely targeted because they'd have to be close enough to get hit by the attack. I like this solution because it addresses the problem at a mechanical level. Harassment and groping is scary as opposed to just disgusting because of power imbalances. Whether that's status, physical strength, or some other advantage, people don't fight back because they feel like they can't fight back. When they can fight back, that's a game changer. The ability to fight back, to smash the crap out of people who try to do these things, would, for me, be highly satisfying, and it wouldn't break the reality of the game. It serves as an in-game deterrent that changes the risk-reward equation for a would-be virtual groper. Go ahead and try it, buddy, but you probably won't like the result. If it's worth dying, perhaps even a loss of XP or a level drain, then go ahead, grope. But this paradigm eliminates the presence of defenseless victims. I think this would be a very empowering paradigm. It would encourage people, notably women, but also men if they choose, to take charge of their situations, to speak up and to take control, to lean in, so to speak. It took me years of getting grabbed, groped, and manhandled at conventions to learn this, to stop being afraid of the backlash that happened when I stood up for myself. I want better than this for others in gaming. This is the only solution I can think of that overcomes the strong, benevolently sexist attitudes in the video game community that men are expected to tolerate more bad behavior than women. Any reporting system involving people would fall prey to the reality that reports from men of inappropriate behavior committed against them seem to be taken less seriously in the gaming community. Then again, it's hardly as though the pageantry surrounding "Protect the Women's" has been especially serious. If you sit back and watch, it's a lot of false outrage that serves more to show what great people the complainers are, as opposed to creating jobs or making the play experience more comfortable. Things don't actually get done. Like the teabagging example. Men have been subjected to threats about raping their mothers, sexually suggestive comments like "suck my dick," and lots of other inappropriate behavior. They've been told that they're expected to just deal with it. So we've been left with a situation where it's not that gamers believe women should be abused. People just don't see certain things as abuse, because that would mean accepting that they themselves have been abused. Speaking from experience, that's really hard. When you pride yourself on being strong, resilient, and tough, admitting to yourself that someone pushed you around, violated your personal boundaries, or outright abused you, that's really hard. It's especially hard for men who've had far less social signaling that these sorts of admissions aren't weakness. They're important steps to preserving your mental health. I've talked to numerous guys over the past week who have confided in me that they don't like being groped either. They just don't feel like they can complain about it, whether it's a man or a woman doing the groping. The stereotype is that men are hypersexualized and actually enjoy non-consensual touching of this kind. It's just not true. The problem is that groping isn't about sex. Groping is about power, and any unwanted touching, sexual gesture, or menacing comment is just wrong, regardless of the gender of the target or the perpetrator. We have serious boundary issues in gaming, starting right at the top with well-documented abuses of staff at major game publishers and mob rule overtaking community discussions about everything. Everyone's afraid of being run out of the community because of smears and whisper campaigns. This is making every topic extremely difficult to talk about because at some point or another, everyone has been somehow complicit in some sort of poor behavior. And I'm including myself in this. I teabagged. I admit it. I can't even claim I didn't know what I was doing was wrong. I did it at the time because I was pissed off. But it's very hard to confront these things when a single bad act gets you designated as evil forever and ever, go die in a fire. People actually say go die in a fire, then claim they're for social justice. It's ridiculous. Granted, I didn't do the teabagging to another player. I did it to a computer-controlled corpse, but I can't let myself off the hook because I did something in-game that I otherwise would have found disgusting. And that's where we get back to the "it's not real" thing. I repeat, that's right. It's not real. And that's relevant. The challenge with VR is that it can feel more real than we've previously experienced. VR experiences are more immersive, and there's also an element of sensory deprivation. When someone touches you in the real world, when you're in VR, it can be startling because it's unexpected. Having a VR headset on is kind of a vulnerable place. And because we want gamers to buy into this vulnerable place, it's high time that the gaming industry starts behaving like adult professionals. We can identify as gamers without encouraging the most juvenile parts of gaming culture. This VR groping scandal was preventable, but the industry was too busy fighting and laying blame to effectively address the potential issues with VR before it landed in the mainstream press. Then, of course, the industry lays blame on the consumer base, with professionals acting like victims themselves, describing themselves as being heartsick that someone was groped in their game. Should we especially care about the feels of a developer who was negligent, who didn't prevent an avoidable trauma? Personally, I don't care. I care that developers fix that problem. Devs get paid to avoid these issues. Mistakes are going to happen, and forgiveness is important, but you don't get a cookie and a pat on the head when you screw up. I'm tired of gamers getting blamed for the negligence and immaturity of game makers, and that's what's happened here again. My message to games makers, the games press, and other professionals within the industry is this: these bad headlines are going to keep happening as long as we continue to use the fans as human shields for the mistakes we make while figuring out this medium. It's time for us to assume responsibility and not let the people who pay us to entertain them continue to take the fall. Some people are just gross. It's true. But based on my inquiries, the vast majority of people who act out in video games do it as an expression of freedom and an awareness that it's not real. They treat virtual worlds as a safe place to violate taboos. They would never do those things in the real world because they know it's wrong. But they also know that in storytelling, someone has to be the villain, and playing the villain is a valid choice as long as you know it's play. Don't want gamers doing that, game makers? Don't let them. You're the ones with the power. But don't attack another game maker for making a different choice than you would. We're still figuring this out. We are still in the experimental phase, and art challenges. So grow up.